Good morning, gentlemen. Dirk here with the MGTOW solution. I'm in the forest, which is where I want to be. To me, this is what MGTOW is all about. Freedom. But today, we're going to talk about women in the workforce. I've got a lot of experience in this area because I've worked with a lot of women. Some good, some not so good. But the timing's pretty good because right now, women are coming out of the fucking woodwork accusing men of sexual harassment. Now, some of those cases are probably legit, but I suspect most of them are bullshit. The other thing that's going on this weekend is the Women's March. They did this last year, and they're doing it again, I think today. All over the world, apparently. Women are going to be complaining about men, talking about how oppressed they are. I find it ironic, coming from a gynocentric culture like ours, that women would still be playing the victim card. But they are, and it is what it is. So I'm going to head out on my little snowshoe hike here. A little later, I'll put the video together and get it online. We'll see you then. Bye.
Chapter 6, Women in the Workplace. I'm not going to attempt to tackle all of the issues surrounding women in the workplace. There are far too many of them to cover here. I'd like to instead offer my personal observations over the course of a long and varied career. I've been in organizations that were mostly women, and others where there were literally no women at all. Most were somewhere in between. During my 36 years in the job market, I've worked with some outstanding women, and I'll point out a few examples. I can even report numerous cases where women have outperformed men. Those women earned my respect, and they still have it. That said, I'm also going to look at the numerous problems I've run into. These, unfortunately, were far more common. Work life began for me when I joined the U.S. Navy at age 17. My first assignment was aboard a destroyer tender out of San Diego. A tender is a repair ship, a non-combatant. As such, this was one of the first Navy ships to have women assigned. I initially thought this would be an advantage, and of course, it did have its perks. But I figured out pretty quickly that there were a lot of problems with this arrangement. What do you suppose happens when you put a bunch of young men and women together, send them to sea for months at a time, and forbid them to fraternize? They have sex anyway, and sometimes they get caught. When this happens, they both go to commanding officer's non-judicial punishment, where the captain doles out appropriate punishment such as restriction or extra duty. This happened constantly. In fact, you could find out who was fucking whom in the plan of the day, a daily document that included results of NJP. When you see a guy busted for fraternization and a girl busted for the same thing, it's pretty obvious. What you end up with is a breakdown in good order and discipline, with people focused on getting laid instead of the mission. A bigger problem, though, was pregnancy. Pregnancy was an instant ticket not only out of deployments, but off of the ship entirely. A lot of women took advantage of that, and they still do. So, as a deployment loomed, we'd have women getting knocked up at the last minute. They'd be transferred to a cushy shore billet somewhere and wouldn't be replaced. Those who remained ended up carrying their load. Other women would start the deployment, decide they didn't like it, and so get pregnant halfway through. They'd be transferred back to the States at the next port of call, again leaving a gap in the ship's crew. This was very common. My second assignment was aboard a battleship out of Norfolk. Being a combatant, there were no women on board, so it was a very different experience. When we were at sea, we didn't have female distractions, so the crew was far more disciplined and professional than the mixed crew aboard the tender ever was. As a bonus, nobody ever had PMS or had to go lie down because of cramps. We'd hook up with women in port, but at sea focus entirely on the tasks at hand, just like the Navy always did. If a guy wasn't pulling his weight, he was called out, to put it lightly. And there was no getting out of deployments, barring some kind of serious injury. Therefore, we put to sea with a full crew, and we returned with a full crew. During this tour, there was one example of superb performance by a female that really impressed me. She was a helicopter pilot, whom I never actually met. I worked the flight deck, signaling helicopters, and we were unloading ammunition from an ammo ship somewhere in the Caribbean. Carrying 2,700-pound projectiles with helicopters and setting them down on moving ships is a delicate business, and this woman was outstanding. She handled her CH-47 with finesse and control all day long. This kind of flying is always impressive, and she was a pleasure to work with. If more women in the military performed to the same standard, then we wouldn't be having ongoing debates about women in the military. But they don't. My next tour was at an assault craft unit in San Diego, my first foray into what is known as the Gator Navy, referring to amphibious operations. The unit was comprised mostly of men, with only a few women assigned to support billets. I can't speak to their performance as they were in administrative jobs and I was at sea. One thing I did notice was the favoritism shown to attractive women. They tended to be assigned to high-visibility admin duties, often reporting directly to senior leadership. Less attractive women were generally relegated to back offices. Thus, the hot ones tended to advance more rapidly. My shore duty as a recruit company commander in San Diego involved very few women. I only trained male recruits. Female recruits all went to Orlando at the time. Some classroom instructors were female, and they were as good as anyone else. I don't really have much to report on regarding this tour, other than to say that my all-male recruit companies were very well disciplined. I transferred back to sea duty at another assault craft unit, this time at Camp Pendleton as a craft master operating amphibious hovercraft. This would be my longest tour, lasting 5 years. My first deployment with the unit was Desert Storm, and both ship's company and my detachment were comprised entirely of men, as were the embarked Marine Corps units. Needless to say, that operation was a resounding success militarily. I won't get into the specifics or the politics, other than to say that the U.S. military and Allied forces performed superbly. I'm sure that women had an impact on that operation, but I wasn't in a position to see it. After that deployment, and about halfway through my tour, some of the rules about women in combat units began to be relaxed a bit, and female sailors started reporting in. At the same time, they were reporting aboard combatant ships, everything except submarines. So, my second deployment from this unit included women. There were only 2 of them in my detachment of 60 sailors, and it wasn't a problem at all. Both were gas turbine techs and were good at their jobs. I was overall in charge of the det, and these 2 women fit in as well as any of the men. It really wasn't an issue. The ship's force, however, was not so fortunate. About 2 months into the deployment, while we were in the Persian Gulf, women started playing the pregnancy card to get off the ship. The people most affected by this were the Combat Information Center team. These are the radar operators who track surface and air contacts and basically coordinate fighting the ship. The problem was that half of the CIC team was female, and all but 1 got knocked up in the Gulf. That left 6 men and 1 woman to do the job of 12 sailors. So they ended up standing double watches, and over time became sleep-deprived zombies. It didn't do a lot for their morale, and it didn't do a lot for mission readiness. It has always astonished me that women would take the drastic measure of having a baby in order to avoid a few months of hardship. The only explanation I can think of is either A, they wanted babies anyway, or B, they weren't thinking long term. At any rate, this is still a very real problem with women in the service. Pointing it out is politically incorrect, so it isn't likely to be solved anytime soon. My final assignment was with the Seabees in an amphibious construction battalion in Coronado. We had maybe 25% women, half of whom were dead weight. Either they couldn't deploy due to various medical conditions, they couldn't hack it in the field, or they simply got pregnant to avoid the difficult tasks. The latter issue got so bad that we had what came to be known as the maternity ward, which was an office where the pregnant sailors did busy work, or just checked in before going to medical appointments. There were usually about a half dozen of them in there at any point. It was a revolving door. During a training exercise in Australia, over half of the deployed females ended up in sickbay, either feigning injuries or suffering from actual dehydration. We were in the jungle for 6 weeks, and it was hot. Operations tempo was high, and we were working our asses off. Well, most of us were. The issue with many of the women was that they didn't like our primitive restroom facilities. So, they'd avoid hydrating despite being ordered to do so. They didn't want to have to pee. So, they'd end up chilling out in the sickbay tent for a day or two, drinking water while all the remainder of us did their work. I couldn't help but notice that all of the sailors in sickbay were female, and there were a lot of them. None of this is to say that every man performed well. Far from it. But when you look at percentages, we had a lot more problems with females per capita. In my mind, the bottom line on women in the military is, can they do the job or not? And will they continue to do it for as long as is required? It doesn't matter if you're good at your job if you can't complete a deployment. After retiring from active duty, I went to work for a small systems integrator in Oceanside, California. It was a fairly small family business and my first job in the private sector. Quite a different world than the military, but I adjusted. I eventually got involved with government contracts and learned that the company had a special status as a woman-owned minority business. Turns out the husband in this little mom-and-pop management team turned over 51% to the wife in order to gain a competitive edge in bidding wars with the government. This despite the fact that she did nothing as far as running the business went. Still, all else being equal, if a woman owns a business, chances are she'll get some contracts handed to her by virtue of simply being female. They both turned out to be backstabbing assholes, but that's another story. I'll never forget one thing he said. "We all sing and dance for someone." He was referring to his wife, who was making some unreasonable demand. Trying to save face, clearly pussy-whipped. We all saw right through it, and he was wrong. I don't sing and dance for anyone, and you're not likely to see much of that in the MGTOW ranks either. I moved around quite a bit after that and found myself in a lot of different jobs. One of them was as a backpacking guide in Yosemite. It was actually my first work experience after going MGTOW. During a particular 4-day trip, I was leading a group comprised of a nice young couple from Spain, a Marine lieutenant colonel, and some 40-year-old chick and her teenage son, both of whom were useless in the wilderness. At our first camp, she announced that they couldn't possibly go on. They were exhausted, totally unprepared, and completely out of shape. I weighed my options and decided that rather than cancel the trip, we'd continue, with me carrying much of their equipment. The Marine also stepped up, as is characteristic of Marines. The next day, we set out with me and the Marine carrying about 80 pounds each, and the pathetic mom and son each carrying about 15 pounds. Everyone ended up having a great trip. The thing is, when you're a guide, you get paid crap. It's customary to tip your guide, assuming they do a good job. The bitch stiffed me. After carrying her gear for 3 days, she stiffed me. This is a woman who, 2 days prior at a camp, explained how much she was enjoying her unemployment benefits, which were extended under Obama. Well, yeah, you don't have to go to work and can still go on vacations? Must be nice. This trip raised my awareness of a few things. First, I don't like babysitting weak, incompetent people. Second, females are often completely self-centered, oblivious to their own parasitic nature. They actually don't care that they are useless. And finally, that I prefer the company of military guys to lazy, entitled people. So I set about getting my master's with the goal of working with the military as a civilian health and fitness guy. After graduating, I went to work as a gym manager and fitness coach for the Marines. I ended up in North Carolina reporting to a woman. I have no problem reporting to a woman if she's competent. I had a female boss at Camp Pendleton, and she was great. But this woman was horrible. She was a morbidly obese fitness programs manager who had a mother complex. She literally referred to her employees as my kids. I told her not to do this in my case, given my age and the inappropriateness of it, but she couldn't seem to stop. She was a classic control freak and micromanager, clearly convinced that the organization was a matriarchy and that this was best. I loved training my Marines, but eventually had enough of her and took a job with the Air Force, working in a physical therapy clinic as an exercise physiologist. Things were pretty good at first. Then we got a new flight commander, a female, who was about to make lieutenant colonel. I can honestly say that in all my experience with the military, that she was the worst officer, by far, that I had ever seen. She was an excellent physical therapist, but a terrible leader and manager. She was attractive for a 40-something and would come into the clinic in catch-me-fuck-me shorts to work out while also prominently displaying her boob job. Now, I like the CrossFit slut with a boob job look as much as the next guy, but this was totally unprofessional for a commissioned officer. That was just for starters. It quickly became clear that she was only interested in interacting with young, attractive men and people who could help her career. Everyone in the clinic noticed that when she had a handsome young patient, she'd see him 3 times a week for months. If you were an older guy, or a woman, she'd transfer you to someone else or simply discharge you from treatment, unless, of course, you were a senior officer that she could network with. This applied to the staff as well. She'd take the young male airmen out on her boat on weekends and always seemed to get along with them at work. We used to call such behavior fraternization, and it would often end an officer's career. Somehow she avoided that, which I attribute to a lack of leadership at higher levels. She treated the women working in the clinic with outright hostility, along with the males such as myself, who were in an older demographic. It was blatantly obvious and had a severe adverse effect on morale, which was in the toilet inside of 6 months. We had a civilian physician put in his retirement papers, while 2 civilian physical therapists took other jobs, as did an occupational therapist. Even one of the front desk receptionists bailed out. The active duty airmen counted the days until they could transfer. My coworker, a kinesiotherapist, also left, followed by yours truly. In short, she left that clinic in a shambles. Yet, because she was a politically motivated master manipulator, she was given a squadron command. Was she sleeping her way to the top? I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise any of us who worked with her. Currently, I work with professional combat troops. These guys are world-class badasses, and they are all men. The field is open to women now, but they haven't exactly flooded the ranks since being given the opportunity. We have none, though we do have 3 females in support functions. One just got pregnant, taking our female deployability rate down to 66%. Just saying. The bottom line is that in my experience, Men are generally more productive, reliable, and professional than women are. Notice I said generally. There are plenty of capable women in the world, as I've pointed out. I can think of several women that I'd be glad to work with again, as well as a lot of useless men. In many cases, the problem may not be a gender issue at all, but that people sometimes pursue careers they aren't suited for. If you're a physically oriented masculine man, then you might not be happy working as a flight attendant. Likewise, if you're a quiet feminine woman, then you might not want to work in construction. Some men are better suited for tech support than law enforcement, just like some women are better suited for assembly lines than administrative work. When you try to force square pegs into round holes in the name of diversity, you're going to have problems. This becomes immediately apparent when you put physically weak individuals into jobs that require physical strength. Doing so is akin to putting a guy who sucks at math into an accounting job. He isn't qualified. At any rate, most of us will have to interact with women at work, and there's something else to consider besides performance: sexual harassment. This is a hot topic, as we all know from attending the ongoing sexual harassment training mandated by the state. It's true that there have been a lot of assholes in the past harassing women hoping to get laid in exchange for favors at work. Not cool. But I suspect the problem isn't nearly as rampant as we're led to believe. There's been a knee-jerk reaction, and now the vast majority of guys who would never do such a thing are continuously subjected to training reminding them not to be Neanderthals at work. From what I've seen, the pendulum has swung too far, as it often does. The definition of sexual harassment has been expanded to include any behavior that a woman perceives as inappropriate. Forget about complimenting a female coworker, and you'd better be careful even looking in her direction. Someone might feel threatened if you simply carry yourself with confidence, accusing you of intimidation. This sexual harassment campaign has provided women with yet another weapon to use against men. If they aren't happy with a decision made by their male supervisor, they can claim he harassed her. The default reaction is usually that he probably did it. Guilty until proven innocent, as is the case in false rape accusations. This can ruin a man's career and reputation, even if the charges are never proven and he's found innocent. Men are aware of this threat, and so are avoiding women at work as much as possible. In today's workplace, we have to be careful to never be alone in a room with a woman, and to be extremely thoughtful with our language. It doesn't really matter if what you say is inappropriate so much as if she says it is. There have been cases of men losing their jobs because a woman simply claimed that he made her feel uncomfortable, with no specifics given. Furthermore, the statute of limitations regarding sexual harassment has recently been lifted. Now, you can accuse a man from 20 years ago, and women are taking advantage of this, mostly when the men involved are wealthy. That way, even if the charges are false, the women may still be able to benefit if the man agrees to settle, in order to shut her the hell up and protect himself from further slander. The bottom line in my experience is that fewer women at work equals fewer problems. Men don't take maternity leave, have fewer medical absences, and aren't as easily offended. Some will dispute these facts and dismiss me as sexist, but that's been my experience. My guess is that most men reading this will say to themselves, "Yep, I see the same shit in my job." All we can do is be careful and make the best of it. Pursuing a line of work with few females will save you a lot of hassles. Having done that myself, I can say that it's been well worth the effort. And that concludes Chapter 6. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.